Thank you, guys, Joseph and Levi. Get this over here. I was assigned this text with the Garden of Gethsemane some months ago, and I have been contending with this text ever since. And well, this last weekend we had the grandkids, and so we had to rent a vehicle, and it had satellite radio in it. And so, if you don't know satellite radio, there's a channel called the Beatles channel. And so we drove out and picked up Silas, and it was just me and the kids in the car, and Paul was sitting in the front seat there with me, and so I tuned in, and it was playing Hey Jude. Marty will know what I'm talking about now, and maybe a few of you others. And it's going through this, Hey Jude, it's through the song, and I'm singing along with it. And it got to the part where Paul McCartney ruined his voice when he's, at the end, na, 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 that part, and then Paul McCartney goes, Hey Judy, Judy. And I'm singing that as the best I can, attempting to ruin my voice. And I don't know why, but I looked over at Paul, and Paul was looking at me, if I can make the face, looking at me like, it was like shock. And are you okay, Pawpaw? And I've never seen Pawpaw do anything like that. Well, that's the way I've been looking at this text for the last 3 or 4 months. I've been looking at it. I can't get my hands around it. It is, Isaac Watts aptly wrote the song about it, too sacred for mortal eyes to see. And I really believe that's what a lot of what's going on in this text. We're going to work our way through this and the actual betrayal and see if we can draw some things from it. I'm going to read the text again from Mark. I like the text in Mark. It has some details that we're going to try to hit on. And so the next couple of slides, we'll be reading the text. And you'd like to follow along on the wall. And they went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, Sit here while I pray. And he took with him Peter and James and John and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch. And going a little further, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. And he came and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak. And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And he came the third time and said to them, Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. And immediately, while he was still sleeping, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign saying, The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard. And when he came, he went up to him at once and said, Rabbi, and he kissed him. And they laid hands on him and seized him. But one of those who stood by drew his sword, struck the servant of the high priest, and cut off his ear. And Jesus said to them, Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled. And they all left and fled. And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body. And they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. A week and a half ago, we talked about the high priest prayer. And this prayer that we're looking at tonight is literally minutes later. The high priest prayer, if you remember our sermon about a week and a half ago, we determined that it was likely worded there on the temple grounds. Jesus had left the upper room, had journeyed through Jerusalem, and sometime right before he leaves Jerusalem and crosses over to Gethsemane, he says that prayer there in John the 17th chapter, John 18, begins with the statement, when Jesus had spoken these words, speaking of the high priest's prayer, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, and he and his disciples entered. So the high priest's prayer has been spoken there, probably on the temple grounds. He's crossed over the valley, the Kidron Brook, or the Kidron Valley, over to the other side where was the Mount of Olives. A little bit about the Mount of Olives. Jerusalem sets up on the highest hill, Zion. There's a valley, and we might call it a creek or a brook. It was a spring-fed waterway there. It had a little trickle of water all the time, the Kidron Brook. And on the other side of that valley was another mountain called, in the Bible, Mount of Olives, or Olivet. And on the west face of that mountain were a series of orchards. We would call them orchards. They were groves where olive trees were planted, and still to this day. There were also cemeteries up there on that mountain. And that's where that's at. Now, when Titus destroyed Jerusalem in 70 A.D., Josephus tells us that he cut all the trees down around Jerusalem. So whatever trees were there in Gethsemane were very likely cut down by Josephus. This is a photograph of the most likely spot where Gethsemane was, and these trees are right at 2,000 years old. So apparently right after Titus destroyed Jerusalem, somebody replanted this garden, and these trees have grown back. And there's two places where they theorize might be the Garden of Gethsemane. This one is the most likely of the two places. And so this gives you a little bit of an image of this garden or this place where these trees are planted. And that was very common on that face of the mountain. A lot of olives planted over there, and it was quite the production there for all olives and olive oil in that area. I don't know if you observed the last verse of the text in Mark, but I want to spend just a few minutes talking about that because I believe it gives us a little bit insight into this place. And I know this may sound like a little bit of a waste of time, but I don't think it is. I think it will help us understand why Jesus is going there, what's going on with this place, and maybe some facts about it. That last verse said, "And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked." Now this has puzzled people for a long time. What I'm going to offer to you is not my idea. This is a idea that you will find out there that people hold. The belief is that was Mark, the man who wrote this book. And the idea goes something like this, and I'm going to walk through these verses to kind of set the stage. Well, first of all, you have to come to the conclusion that either this young man is some kind of pervert, and he thinks it's 1974 and he's streaking, which is not, that would be no, that's not what happened. Or he was asleep out there. That he was sleeping out there, and having wrapped himself in some kind of sleeping cloth, he got up and he was startled. He was woke up by what was going on, which is a much more likely scenario. Okay, let's look through these verses, and it'll kind of build for us what is a very possible explanation. First of all, notice that the upper room that Jesus was in was a large upper room there in Mark 14. There were not many large houses in Jerusalem. This large upper room is likely the place they met in Acts 1. It's very likely the place they met in Acts 4, or rather Acts 12. It was a home large enough to have an upper room that would support 120 people. So it's a large home. It was likely an upper city, the higher part of the city, and it would have been a person that owned this home that would have been a person of means. So that's the first thing we want to kind of get out there is there's a large home inside of Jerusalem with a large upper room, and that's where Jesus has the Last Supper. Luke 21 tells us that and Luke is describing generally what's going on. He says, "But at night he went out and lodged on the mount called Olivet." So this was something he did routinely. When Jesus was in and around Jerusalem, he had two places he would stay. He would either walk around Mount Olivet to the backside of the mountain to Bethany and stay with Mary and Martha and Lazarus, but that was quite a little walk. So if he stayed late in the city of Jerusalem, he would need a place much closer. And so this Mount of Olivet, which is right outside the gate, would be a much handier place if he were staying, say, late in the city like he did, especially the last week of his life. So Luke says that that's what he did. That was his custom. Notice also in Luke 22:39, he says it again, "And he came and went out as was his custom to the Mount of Olives." So this is where Jesus slept. When he was in Jerusalem, one of his common places to go at night was the Mount of Olives. He went out there, he slept there. This was You might say his, his home, almost, you might say. So this wasn't just some place he happened to be on this night. This was a place he went routinely, which might explain why the disciples went to sleep, because they're used to going out there and going to sleep. That's what they did. There are these trips to Jerusalem that they took. So nevertheless, that's the second factoid we've got, is this garden was a place he went routinely, which means he probably knew the owner. It wouldn't be like Jesus to go sleep on somebody else's property without some kind of permission. I would wrestle with that being the case, especially if he's out there a lot, if he's doing that a lot. So I would conclude he likely knows the owner. John 18, verse 2, now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas betrays Jesus on the fact that that's where Jesus goes all the time. Judas, think about it. Judas is going to point him out to the high priest so they can go catch him. Well, Judas knows where he's going to be. He's going to be out there at that Mount of Olives, because that's where he goes all the time. So it was a real custom for Jesus to do that. Now then, let's dial ahead a little bit. There's a fellow named Barnabas, Acts 4, verse 36, 37, that was a man of means. He owned a piece of property, he sold it, and he laid that money at the apostles' feet, and that property, he was from Cyprus. So Barnabas is a man of some means. Now, we don't know if he's wealthy. It is believed by a lot of folks that write about Barnabas that he was a fairly wealthy man. This verse indicates he was to some degree a man of means. Acts 12, verse 12 through 17, I just got select text there. When he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, where they were gathered together, and it goes on to say, this is Peter after he got out of prison, it goes on to say, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. Okay, so Mary, the mother of Mark, which by the way is Barnabas' sister, so you got Barnabas and Mary, brother and sister. Mark is Mary's son. Mary owns a large home in Jerusalem, likely the upper room, and she's wealthy enough to have servants. And she is wealthy enough to own a home where in Acts 12 a lot of people are gathered together, and Peter knows that's where they're going to be. And then you find out in Colossians 4 and 10 that Barnabas and Mary are brother and sister, and that Mark is the nephew. There's a translation issue there, but he was the nephew of Barnabas. And that's why Paul and Barnabas get in the big issue about Mark. Okay, having said all of that, here goes the theory. These things are facts. You can't argue with this, but here's the theory. Mark was working in his mother's orchard. He had been out there all day long, as was the Jewish custom, gathering olives, pressing them, making oil. It's hard work. And they would stay all day long, and they would quite often sleep in those orchards or those groves at night. That is what they did. So he's worked all day long, and he's tired. The day's over, and so he lays down, wraps himself in a blanket, and he goes to sleep. And then the noise of what's happening spooks him. He hears it. He hears the prayer. He hears the apostles. When they take off after having been betrayed, he follows them. The soldiers grab the cloth, and he runs away naked. That fits the facts. And I'll tell you what else it does. It puts an eyewitness at the life of Christ. And it means that we can turn to the book of Mark and know that this is Peter's narrative to Mark, but it's also Mark who was there. Now, there's a lot more we could say about that, and I just offer that as a possibility, but it is a possibility that fits the facts and makes the most sense. If you just think about the different scenarios of why would he be there, and why would he have been out here at the middle of the night and so on, this is the one that makes the most sense. Okay, having said that, Jesus now has crossed the brook and he has gone into this garden of Gethsemane. He's walked in there and he's taken his disciples with him. Now, Jesus' circumstances are about to change dramatically. And as he goes into this garden, I want you to think about what happens to him. It's almost like he continues to go into concentric circles of darkness. First, he has 11 disciples with him because Judas isn't with them. He takes the 11 with him, and he goes into Gethsemane, and here they are now in the Garden of Gethsemane. And then he takes with him and then Jesus went with him to a place called Gethsemane and said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray that you not enter temptation. So he leaves the 11, or actually he leaves the 8, and says, sit here and pray that you don't enter temptation. And then he takes Peter, James, and John, Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, with him a little further. And he says to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." So he leaves the 8. He goes a little deeper into the garden, a little deeper into the darkness. And he's got Peter and James and John, and he tells them, "Wait here." And the Bible describes him, he says, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. I want you to really let those words burn into your mind. Sorrowful and troubled. And then he said, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death." I was listening to a fellow talk about this passage, and he said, you think they would have edited this part out, right? This is the creator of the universe. This is the Son of God, and he's overwhelmed. This is a little bit inconvenient to read for us. I mean, we're going to begin to wrestle with Christ the man and the weight of what's about to happen to him. Now, I want you to think about being overwhelmed, because that's what he's telling Peter, James, and John. I am overwhelmed. We've all had occasions, things happen to us where it was just more than we could take. We break down and we cry or whatever. There's been times, I don't know how to explain this, but there's been times where things have happened to me where it's like a dark ring forms in my vision, and all I can see is like right here. I don't know what it is, but that's happened a few times to me where it's just the moment is so overwhelming. Anger usually is what does that, which is why it's a bad thing. Maybe you've lost a loved one, or you failed a test, or you miss your mom and dad, or whatever. And you really feel overwhelmed. You just don't think you can move through it. That's where Jesus is, the creator of the universe. That's where he's at right now. And he tells Peter, James, and John, stay right here and watch with me. And going a little further, and Luke adds about a stone's throw, he fell on his face and prayed. He is so overwhelmed that he doesn't go through the traditional bowing and all. He falls on his face and he prays, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." So imagine if he's left the apostles, let's point out this way. He's left the apostles out in the parking lot, 8 of them. He's come up to about that corner of our building right here, and he's left Peter, James, and John, and then he walks over here to about this corner. That's about a stone's throw, something like that. And now he's gone further into the third concentric circle of darkness, so to speak, away from them all, and he's completely by himself. He is overwhelmed in the moment to the point that he falls on the ground, and he says, "Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." I have wrestled with this statement, what he's going through and what this means and why we're told this and all of these things. Well, the prayer was a short prayer. And he comes back to the disciples, and he finds them sleeping. He says to Peter, so he's over here, he walks back over there, and they're asleep. He says to Peter, "So you could not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." I don't know why the apostles went to sleep. It doesn't seem like it would have been very long. It's a short prayer and it's a short walk. Whatever the case, they're asleep. He gets on to them. And the text tells us then he goes back a second time. Now, I have stitched together the 4 accounts as best I can to create a sort of a congruent narrative of everything that's happening here. So the second time he goes back over here, he went away and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. Whatever feeling of being overwhelmed he had when he went over there the first time, it's worse now. The first prayer did not resolve his feeling of being overwhelmed. He goes back, talks to the apostles, gets on to being asleep. He goes back the second time, and he's so overwhelmed, so burdened by what's about to happen, that an angel is sent strengthening him. And the word strengthen has to do with muscles, that kind of strengthening him. And notice, after the angel strengthens him, watch what it says. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. This is after the angel did what the angel did. The angel strengthens him, and now in agony he prays more earnestly. And his sweat become like great drops of blood falling to the ground. I think he's as overwhelmed as a human being can be at this point. Like I said, I'm like Paul looking at his Paul. I don't know what to say about that. It's so hard to grasp. He came back, found them asleep. Their eyes were heavy, so leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words again. Goes back, prays a third time, same words. Father, if there's any way, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will. He comes back from that prayer, and the disciples said to him, then he came to the disciples and said to them, sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. One of the things I do when I study a text like this is I ask questions of the text. Just ask it questions, and then read it and 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 think about it and read it and pray about it and read it and see if you can find answers. And these are some of the questions I asked myself about this text. Jesus is overwhelmed. The one that calmed the sea and raised the dead? The one that stepped out onto the water and walked on it is overwhelmed? The one that walked up to the tomb and said, Lazarus, come forth? The one who caught the funeral procession up there by Nazareth and walked up to the funeral procession and raised the little girl there at that occasion. The one who had to sneak out before the people from his hometown would stone him there in Nazareth. The one who calmed the storm. Now he's overwhelmed? I don't know what to do with that, except to know that he is 100% man. And just as much as you and I would be overwhelmed at the sight of what he's about to go through, so was he, completely overwhelmed. Another question. If the angel strengthened him, why did he continue to pray in agony? Okay, remember? He's praying, he's overwhelmed, and the angel is sent and strengthens him. The text doesn't say the angel was sent to strengthen him. The text says the angel strengthened him. And after the angel strengthened him, the text says that he continued to pray in agony. What if the angel hadn't strengthened him? And what did the angel do? Did the angel help? And why does he go back a third time? Why a second time? And why a third time? The same prayer. Is there some significance in that? There's some meanings, sometimes numbers in the Bible mean things. There's something to that. And how is it that the text says Jesus prayed more earnestly? What was his first prayers only partially earnest? Was he just casually praying the first time? I don't think so. No, even after the angel came and strengthened him, he prayed more earnestly. And how did the apostles manage to go to sleep so quickly? Stone's throw, short prayer, back, and Jesus said, couldn't you watch for an hour? That's a what do you call it? It's a metaphor, it's a phrase. It doesn't mean he was gone an hour. Well, I don't really have good answers to these questions, but I want to set the stage for what Jesus is about to go through, because I think in that we find some of what's going on here. The Bible tells us that Jesus said while he was on the cross, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? Isaiah 53 makes it clear that the payment for sin began in the process of his trial. Him paying our sin debt didn't wait till the first nail went in. No, it actually began during the process of the trial. By his stripes we are healed. Isaiah 53 makes it clear that this is an event that occurs all the way from his being taken into custody till the time he dies. That's the payment for sin. Well, Jesus is about to be taken into custody. Here at the Garden of Gethsemane, he stands at the threshold of something happening. And the threshold of that, of about what's to happen, is he's forsaken by God. Number two, the Bible says that in Galatians that he saved us by becoming a curse for us. Jesus became a curse. Peter describes it in 1 Peter 3, that he bore, or rather 1 Peter 2, that he bore our sins in his body on the tree. Once you put those two verses together, he became a curse and he bore our sins in his body. Put those two thoughts together. The very flesh of Jesus Christ became cursed. And in it being cursed, sin was thrust into his flesh. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he knew that was coming. He understood exactly what was about to happen. Now maybe we can come up with some comparison to help understand that. Imagine if the flesh of your arm immediately rotted in place. I'm talking about zombie stuff here, right? Imagine it just immediately rotted in place. It became a curse. But it's not just physical rot, it's the rot of all of the evil of the world combined into one moment into your flesh. Warren had me pick out a splinter out of his finger today. We worked a couple of days ago in the flower bed, and he got a splinter in his finger, and we'll pick that out before it gets infected. Because it hurt. How much would it hurt if all of mankind's sin, all of it, every broken heart, every evil deed, every murder, every lie, the deeds of Hitler, the deeds of Pol Pot, the deeds of Maoist China, the deeds of Stalin, and the deeds of Mike Minson were thrust into your flesh all at once. And in that you became, you're not called a curse, you became a curse. This is what is about to happen to Jesus. He made him to be sin. What was hanging on the cross? Pure sin. My sin and your sin. I don't know how to describe that. And I certainly don't know how to describe what overwhelming moment Christ is going through. I just don't know. I have a painting in my house that a fellow that used to go to church with us painted this, and I love this painting. I'm going to take a moment to describe it because it is of the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Gethsemane. I told him, his fellow's name was David, I said, David, paint Man of Sorrows for me. And he said, after a week or so, he said, well, I'm going to paint an impressionistic view of the Garden of Gethsemane. And I said, okay, whatever that is. I'm not an art guy, so I don't know. And he painted this, and he brought it to me. And I said, okay, well, kind of walk me through it a little bit. He said, well, if you can see in the lower middle of this painting is this man burdened down with the weight of whatever is over him. And he says that's an impressionist view of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. In the distance is the glory of God. Remember what we talked about a week and a half. Jesus was looking for the glory of the cross, John 17 and John 12. And he knew that was coming. For him to do the will of the Lord, to go to the cross, was going to glorify God. And he knew that was coming. And so in the distance, looming on the horizon, is the glory of God shining down, almost like the weight of all of that is coming down on him. And I don't know if you can see it or not, but spiraling around that is all of that red, indicating all of the violence and wrath and hate that's about to be poured out from the glory of God onto the sin of mankind. This is just an artist trying to capture, in some impressionistic way, what was happening to Jesus at the Garden of Gethsemane. How dare I ask questions about it? He was overwhelmed. He prayed a prayer that I don't really understand. But I am so thankful that he did. Well, as the story goes on, Judas shows up for the betrayal. And I've got these next two slides. I don't expect you to read those, but I did a spreadsheet. I do this quite often. Is I just kind of put moment by moment what's happening. You know, sort of the highlights of it, the various verses, the text, trying to build because as you read the four accounts, they don't seem to be perfectly congruent. And I was trying to figure that out. And essentially what you have is Judas does a lot of planning with these guys. He tells them, I know where he meets. I'm going to kiss him. When I kiss him, you grab him. So the mob goes out there. The mob walks out. Jesus says some things to them as they come up. Judas approaches him, kisses him. Jesus says some things to Judas, one of which is, really? It's kind of funny. You know, really? You're going to betray me with a kiss? Really? Is that what this is, you know? Goes through that. And then they grab him, take him into custody. Some of the other apostles say, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? So that it's not just Peter here. They all have that in mind. Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And of course, Peter doesn't wait for approval. He grabs the sword and cuts the guy's ear off. John, of course, is nice to tell us who the guy's name, Malchus. John was known to the high priest. He knew who the high priest was. The high priest knew him, so he seems to know some of these people. Anyway, Jesus heals the man and then has some more conversation with him, and finally the disciples flee and they take him away, and then this young man with this linen cloth, we have that little detail there at the end. That's sort of the series of events. Well, I just want to ask some questions or make some observations about this event also, because remember, Jesus has emerged from the third circle of darkness, being overwhelmed in a way that I can't even understand. I mean, we can't understand. He comes out of that, and I want you to watch the difference in the things he has to say. Friend, do what you came to do. And Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? Whatever those three prayers did, it completely changed the tenor of Jesus' speech. He went in there exceedingly sorrowful. He went in there being overwhelmed. He went in there telling Peter, James, and John, I am exceedingly sorrowful even unto death. And Luke observes that as he prayed more earnestly, it's like drops of sweat or like blood falling from him. He is so overwhelmed in the moment. And now, he's very coherent. He's got himself together. And he says with clarity and certainty, friend, do what you came to do. And Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? Does this sound like a man who just moments earlier said, I am exceedingly sorrowful even unto death? Something has happened here. Something has happened with Jesus. He doesn't look overwhelmed anymore. He doesn't sound like a man that is overwhelmed. So when they cut the guy's ear off, Peter does, Jesus says, no more of this. See how certain and clear that statement is? There's no ambiguity into it. There's no struggling. There's no overwhelmed. This enough. No more of this. Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should the Scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so? There is so much to say about this statement versus the prayer that he offered. Now just think about this now. Jesus has just prayed, Father, if there's another way, let it be, but if not, your will be done. And now he tells the disciples, don't you know I could have called for another way? I could have called for 12 legions of angels. I could have stopped this. Don't you know that? I could have made it so that I don't have to go into this garden overwhelmed. I could have put a stop to this whole thing. It would not happen. Nevertheless, your will be done. I want you to notice how Jesus puts two things side by side. This is very important. In his prayer, he said, nevertheless, your will be done. Father, I'm not going to call the angels. No, let's let your will be done. And here he says the same thing but uses different words. But how then should the Scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so? Jesus says the Lord's will being done is synonymous with the Scriptures, the words of the Scripture. Don't ever let anybody laugh at you, make fun of you, or ridicule you because you look at the Scriptures and call this the will of God. We have a great example in the person of Jesus Christ who did exactly that right here. Jesus looked at the Scriptures and said the Scriptures must be fulfilled. The Father's will must be done, and I don't care if I can call 12 legions of angels. Our song says 10,000 angels. It's a writer's right to do that, but it's really 12 legions of angels. He could have, but how would the Lord's will, the Scriptures, be fulfilled? I think that's a very important observation, and I find this in this case, I find what's happening here is the absolution that Jesus has, the certainty, the ability now to speak clearly and without doubt is because he is doing precisely that. He is trusting in the will of God. He's turned it over to what God has willed, what the Scriptures have said. And he's not concerned about it. He's no longer overwhelmed. Does this sound like a man that is overwhelmed? Does this sound like a man that can barely speak, that is sweating so heavy it looks like blood? Does these words sound like that, man? Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all of this has taken place that the Scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. Why did he say that? Why does he say this to the high priest and their servants? It's an interesting point because he had just been in the temple grounds all day. Hey, why didn't you arrest me there? I was right there. What do you think? Oh, you caught me. It's not like he'd been hiding from them. He'd been in the temple grounds every day. Well, you come out here with torches and clubs and swords. I was there every day. And of course, the reason is they wanted to catch him away from the people, and they weren't sure where he was sleeping at night. But Judas knew where he would be sleeping at night. But there's something else going on here too, I think. 54 days later, Peter is going to stand up and say, "You by wicked hands have crucified the Son of God." And some of these people, some of these servants of the high priest, some of the people in this mob will hear those words and obey the Lord in baptism. And I have no doubt that they would have thought back to this moment and said, that's right. This thing was, this was a mess from the beginning. This wasn't right. Jesus, with clarity, great clarity, shows them the hypocrisy of what's happening. Why didn't you arrest me when I was in the temple, on the temple grounds? What's this show about? Does that sound like a man that's overwhelmed? This sounds like a man to me who's got certainty about what he's doing because he's resigned himself to the will of God. And then finally, as they're taking him into custody, he said, I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go. Thank heavens. How prophetic. As he stands there, stepping across the threshold of becoming a curse, of becoming sin. Just as he steps across that threshold, he points to the rest of us and says, let them go. And that's exactly what he did in that moment. He took the punishment so that these men could go. I wished I could have given you more clear vision into this prayer, but I think Isaac Watts was right. Too sacred for mortal eyes to see. Hope you've enjoyed the study this evening. If you'd like to obey the Lord in baptism this evening, or if you'd like to request the prayers of the church, a song has been selected that's meant to encourage you. And if you'll come forward and take a seat on the front, we'll assist you while we sing this song.